Mark had been searching for a cheap car on Craigslist for weeks. His car had finally given up the ghost, and he was desperate. One rainy Saturday night, he found a posting that seemed like the answer to his prayers. A used Honda Civic, listed for half the market price, need gone ASAP. He clicked the ad, scanning the photos of the beat-up but functional car, and quickly messaged the seller. Within minutes, he got a reply. The seller, who called himself Brian, was eager to sell the car that night. Just needed off my property, he'd said, and was even willing to knock off an extra $100 if Mark could come right away. Mark hesitated, glancing out the window at the pouring rain, but the urgency in the message spurred him on. He figured it would be fine, just a quick transaction, and he'd be on his way home. He grabbed his rain jacket, pocketed a flashlight, and set off toward the address Brian had given him. As he drove further into the outskirts of town, the streetlights grew sparse, and eventually there was only darkness and the occasional reflective eyes of animals caught in his headlights. After 20 minutes, he pulled up to a broken-down farmhouse with no lights in the windows, the house almost obscured by shadows and overgrown trees. The car sat out front, but Mark felt an uneasy chill run down his spine as he scanned the abandoned property. He parked and checked his phone, hoping to message Brian to say he'd arrived, but he had no service. Of course, he thought with a sinking feeling, in a place this remote. Pulling up the hood of his jacket, he stepped out of the car and cautiously approached the Honda parked on the muddy gravel. The car was in rougher shape than the photos had suggested. A long, jagged crack ran across the windshield, and the passenger side door was scratched and dented. Mark bent down, shining his flashlight over the tires, feeling a pit of disappointment in his stomach as he realized the deal might be too good to be true. Suddenly, he heard the creak of the farmhouse door. He looked up to see a tall, thin figure standing in the doorway, barely illuminated by his flashlight. "Brian?" Mark called out, trying to sound casual, though his voice quivered slightly. The figure just stared at him, unmoving. Mark's skin prickled with unease as the seconds stretched on. Then the figure raised an arm, motioning for him to come closer to the house. Mark swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He'd driven out this far, he reasoned. He couldn't back out now. Trying to seem relaxed, he walked up the steps toward the man in the doorway. "Hey, I'm Mark. You Brian?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned around and started walking back inside, leaving the door ajar. Mark hesitated, but then he noticed a flickering light coming from inside. His curiosity got the best of him, and he stepped through the door into the dimly lit interior of the house. The smell hit him immediately, a thick, metallic tang that sent waves of nausea roiling through him. It reminded him of iron and something fouler, like wet earth and decay. The flashlight's beam shook in his hand as he swept it across the room. Old, broken furniture was scattered about, and the walls were smeared with strange, rust-colored stains. Mark tried not to look too closely, his breath catching in his throat as he saw what looked like deep scratches carved into the wood. In the center of the room was a single candle, flickering feebly, casting long shadows. As he approached it, he caught sight of a figure in the corner, huddled and shivering, covered by a dirty sheet. He backed up, nearly stumbling, as he realized it was a person, a woman who looked up at him with hollow, terrified eyes. "Please, don't leave me," she whispered, her voice weak, barely audible. Mark's stomach turned. What are you doing here?" he stammered, horrified by the pleading in her eyes. He reached for his phone, only to remember there was no service. The woman began to cry, and her gaze darted to the doorway. "He'll be back soon," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark felt the blood drain from his face as he turned back toward the entrance. The man who had led him inside, Brian, or whoever he was now blocking the doorway, his face partially hidden in the shadows, his expression unreadable. Is there a problem?" Mark managed to stammer, trying to hide the terror that was seizing his chest. The man stepped forward, his lips twisting into a slow, unnatural smile. "You came for the car, right?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I never said you could leave with it." He turned to the woman in the corner, who had drawn her knees up to her chest, shaking violently. "She tried to leave too, he said, his voice growing cold and harsh. "Didn't get far." His smile widened, revealing yellowed, crooked teeth. Mark backed away, his heart hammering in his chest, the reality of the situation sinking in. He was trapped. Desperation surged through him as he searched for another way out, his mind racing. Suddenly, the lights flickered off, plunging the room into total darkness. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling him in the dark. He tried to scream, but a rough hand clamped over his mouth, dragging him backwards. He struggled, thrashing wildly, but his captor's grip was iron strong, his cold breath seeping into Mark's skin as he whispered, "Craigslist buyers, always so eager, so trusting." Mark's vision started to blur, his lungs burning, as the last thing he saw was the woman's terrified face, her eyes hollow with despair as she whispered, "He never lets anyone go." The house remained silent after that, hidden away in the lonely dark, the broken car waiting outside as the rain poured down. Danielle had just moved to a new city, leaving behind her small town in search of a fresh start. Money was tight, so she scanned Craigslist for affordable furniture. Late one night, she found a deal that seemed almost too good to be true. A high-end antique wardrobe, solid wood, listed for only $50. The ad said it was haunted, which she thought was a lame joke to add mystery. She dismissed it and decided to message the seller. The seller, a woman named Linda, responded almost immediately. She insisted Danielle come pick it up that night, saying it had to be out of her house before midnight. The urgency was odd, but Danielle brushed it off, chalking it up to someone eager to get rid of an old piece. After all, it was Craigslist. People sold odd things all the time. She shrugged, grabbed her keys, and headed out into the chilly night. Linda's house was on the outskirts of the city, past rows of abandoned buildings and empty fields. By the time Danielle arrived, she was surrounded by darkness, and her headlights were the only source of light. She pulled up to the address, a ramshackle, creaking house with a single dim light illuminating the front porch. She barely had time to shut her car door when Linda flung open the front door and waved her over. "Come in. Hurry," Linda whispered, her voice thin and frantic. Danielle hesitated, but followed. Inside, the house was unsettlingly cold and smelled faintly of mildew. The place was sparsely furnished, the walls cracked and peeling. In the center of the living room stood the wardrobe. It was beautiful, covered in intricate carvings of twisted branches and figures with hollow eyes. It seemed almost to breathe under the dim lighting, its wood dark and polished, as if recently wiped down. Linda was silent for a moment, watching Danielle with an unreadable expression before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "It needs to be gone before midnight. Do you understand?" Danielle nodded, though she was now more unnerved than ever. But the wardrobe was beautiful, and she reasoned that Linda was just an eccentric old woman with a spooky sense of humor. She helped Linda load it into her car, noticing how light it felt despite its size. Linda didn't say goodbye. She just closed the door with a resolute finality, as if relieved to be rid of both Danielle and the wardrobe. The drive back was quiet, and Danielle felt a strange, prickling sensation crawling up her spine the entire time. She kept glancing in her rearview mirror, expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. But the wardrobe just sat there, motionless, its carved figures casting shadows across the car interior. Back in her apartment, she positioned the wardrobe in her bedroom. By now, it was nearly 1 a.m., and she was exhausted. She climbed into bed, but her mind kept drifting back to the carved figures, their hollow eyes seeming to follow her even in the dark. Finally, she drifted into an uneasy sleep. A loud thump jolted her awake sometime later, her heart pounding in the silent room. She listened, her breath catching as another thump sounded, closer this time. She turned to see the wardrobe in the corner, its dark wood glinting faintly in the moonlight. Her skin prickled as she noticed the wardrobe door, which she'd left closed, now hung open just a crack. She forced herself to lie still, reasoning that she must have forgotten to latch it, that it was nothing, that she was just spooking herself. But as she stared, she realized with growing dread that the figures on the wardrobe had changed. They were no longer still. They seemed to shift subtly, their faces warped, expressions twisted into eerie grins. One figure at the top seemed to have turned completely around, facing directly toward her. A chill ran through her body. She couldn't look away, even as the air seemed to grow thick and cold around her. Then she heard it. A faint scratching like nails dragging along wood, coming from inside the wardrobe. She tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed. Her heart hammered painfully as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. In the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move from within the wardrobe, something crawling, pressing against the inside as if it was desperate to escape. Finally, her voice found her, and she screamed, bolting upright in bed. The scratching stopped. The room was silent. save for her rapid breathing and the distant hum of her heater. Trembling, she forced herself to move, grabbing a heavy book off her nightstand as a makeshift weapon, and approached the wardrobe, inching closer with every hesitant step. Holding her breath, she flung the doors open. The interior was empty, just a barren space of polished wood. She felt a rush of relief, but then she noticed something strange. Dark red stains running along the inside walls, faint but unmistakable, as though something had clawed at them, desperate to get out. Danielle slammed the wardrobe shut, her hands shaking. She didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting rigidly in bed and keeping her eyes on the wardrobe until dawn broke. The sunlight did little to ease her fear, but she told herself it was all in her head, that she was just tired and stressed. That morning, she listed the wardrobe back on Craigslist, determined to be rid of it, but strangely, the post wouldn't publish. Every time she tried, the screen would glitch, her browser freezing and crashing as though something was preventing her from posting it. The wardrobe stayed. Every night, the scratching continued, growing louder, the hollow-eyed figures seeming to shift and twist every time she looked at them. And each morning, she tried again to list it, only for the ad to disappear from the screen. One night, in desperation, she decided to leave the apartment, hoping to escape the endless torment. But as she grabbed her keys, she noticed the wardrobe door was wide open. Sitting on the floor inside, in a perfectly straight line, was every item she had ever posted to Craigslist, each one scratched, broken, or defaced as if torn by claws. Then she felt it, a hand, cold and bony, wrapping around her wrist. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, and from inside the wardrobe she saw those hollow eyes watching her, grinning wider than ever. The last thing she heard was the door of the wardrobe slamming shut. In the morning, her apartment was empty, the wardrobe standing eerily silent, waiting for its next owner to claim it, and hear the scratching from within. Kyle was looking for a job. He'd recently moved to a new city and found himself strapped for cash, so he started scouring Craigslist for any gig that paid decently. Late one night, he stumbled across an ad titled, "Easy Night Shift Work, Big Pay, Just Sit in a Room." It promised $500 for a single night, which seemed absurdly high. The only details in the ad were a few vague lines. No experience necessary, must be reliable, must be willing to stay awake from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. It seemed fishy, but desperation made him ignore his reservations. He sent a quick message and almost immediately received a reply with a time, an address, and a final, chilling instruction. Under no circumstances are you to leave the room until your shift is complete. The address was a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. When Kyle arrived, he found the building abandoned, surrounded by nothing but dark fields stretching endlessly in all directions. He parked his car and approached a heavy metal door on the side of the warehouse, where a man in a dark suit and glasses stood waiting. The man's face was expressionless, almost mechanical, as he silently handed Kyle an envelope containing $500 in cash, a contract, and a key. The contract was disturbingly brief. You agree to sit in the provided room for 6 hours. Do not leave the room under any circumstances. Do not look out the windows. Do not open the door for anyone. The rules sent a shiver down Kyle's spine, but the money was too tempting to pass up. He nodded, signing the contract with a shaky hand. The man said nothing as he gestured for Kyle to follow him inside. They walked down a long, dimly lit hallway to a single room. It was barren, with just a metal chair, a bare light bulb hanging overhead, and a clock ticking loudly on the wall. A large rectangular window faced the hallway, and beyond it, Kyle could see only darkness. The man handed him the key, then closed the door, leaving Kyle alone with nothing but the hum of the overhead light and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Hours passed in silence. Kyle tried to stay occupied, tapping his fingers on the chair, whistling to himself, anything to make the time pass faster. As the clock neared midnight, though, he began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible were lurking just beyond the door. Every now and then he'd catch himself glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching him. Then, just after midnight, a faint, scraping noise echoed from somewhere beyond the room. Kyle froze, every nerve in his body on edge. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like nails dragging along concrete. He tried to convince himself it was just an animal or the old building settling, but deep down, He knew it wasn't that. The scraping continued, growing louder, moving closer. His palms were sweaty, and he gripped the edge of his chair, his heart pounding. Then he heard a faint knock on the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. He stared at the door, terrified, remembering the contract's words, "Do not open the door for anyone." He forced himself to stay still, barely breathing. After a few tense moments, the knocking stopped and a strange, dragging sound followed, like something heavy being pulled away. Kyle let out a shaky breath, trying to calm himself, but a few minutes later, he heard it again. This time the knock was louder, more insistent. 3 taps, each one reverberating through the silent room. He wanted to shout, to demand who was there, but fear kept him silent. The knocking stopped again, but this time he saw a faint shadow through the window. Someone was standing just outside, their face obscured, watching him. The figure was still, almost unnaturally so, their face barely visible in the dim light. Kyle felt a surge of panic as he remembered the contract's second rule: do not look out the windows. He quickly averted his gaze, his heart hammering, but he could still feel the figure's gaze burning into him. The minutes dragged by, each second stretching into eternity. Then the shadow outside the window started moving, pacing back and forth, its silhouette unnatural, limbs bending in ways that didn't seem human. Kyle squeezed his eyes shut, silently willing himself to ignore it, but the figure began to tap on the window, each tap louder than the last, as if demanding his attention. He clenched his fists, praying for the figure to leave, but the tapping only grew more insistent. Finally, in a moment of weakness, he glanced at the window. He instantly regretted it. The figure's face was pressed against the glass, grinning widely, its features distorted, stretched, as though they'd been smeared across its face. Hollow eyes stared into his, unblinking, with a chilling intelligence that sent ice through his veins. The figure's mouth stretched into an impossibly wide smile, teeth bared, the grin so grotesque it looked like it might split its face in two. Kyle jerked back, clutching his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure's grin only grew wider, its eyes locking onto his as it slowly raised a bony hand, tapping on the glass with one long blackened fingernail. Then it whispered his name. The voice was barely audible, a rasping sound that seemed to crawl into his mind. "Kyle! Come out! We've been waiting." Kyle stumbled backward, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't open the door, but every instinct was screaming at him to flee, to get as far from that room as possible. He turned, eyeing the door, but the second he moved, the tapping turned into a furious pounding, as though the figure were trying to break through the glass. Panicked, Kyle grabbed the chair, his only weapon, holding it in front of him as the pounding grew louder and louder. The figure's voice grew shrill, almost hysterical, calling his name over and over in a twisted, sing-song tone. He could feel his sanity slipping, the walls closing in as the figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the room. Then, as the clock struck 4, the pounding stopped. The room fell silent. Kyle collapsed to the floor, trembling, barely able to breathe. He stayed there, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But after a few minutes, he heard footsteps approaching down the hall. The door creaked open, and the man in the suit stepped inside, his face as expressionless as before. "Your shift is complete," he said simply, extending his hand for the key. Kyle could barely move, his body numb with terror. He handed the key over, stumbling to his feet. The man watched him with cold eyes, then glanced at the window where the figure had been. There was no trace of it left, only Kyle's pale reflection staring back at him. What was that?" Kyle stammered, but the man merely smiled, a hint of amusement flickering across his face. "Some doors," he said, his voice low and cryptic, "are better left unopened." Without another word, he turned and led Kyle back down the hallway. As they reached the exit, Kyle cast one last glance at the darkened window, half expecting to see the figure watching him. He drove home in silence, clutching the envelope in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something was still watching him. When he finally reached his apartment, he found a new message waiting for him on Craigslist. It was from the same man, and it read simply, "We'll see you again soon." Kyle stared at the screen, his hand shaking as he deleted the message, but deep down, he knew it was useless. He'd opened the door, and now they were waiting for him. Sarah was moving into her first apartment alone and needed to furnish it on a tight budget. She spent hours on Craigslist, scrolling through endless listings until she found an ad for a large, vintage mirror priced at only $10. The mirror was elegant, with a dark wooden frame intricately carved with vines and flowers. In the photo, it looked well kept, almost as if it were brand new. The seller's message was brief, just a single line: "Take it off my hands, ASAP. First come, first served." Sarah messaged immediately, and after a brief exchange, the seller gave her an address across town and insisted she come that night. She shrugged off the odd urgency, figuring the seller was simply eager to declutter. After all, $10 for a beautiful antique mirror was a steal. As she pulled up to the address, she found herself outside an old, crumbling house surrounded by leafless trees, their skeletal branches casting eerie shadows in the fading evening light. The house was dim, with no sign of anyone inside, but the door was cracked open and she could see the mirror waiting for her in the entryway, propped against the wall. She called out, "Hello?" but received no response. She stepped inside hesitantly, glancing around, feeling the heavy, stale air pressing in on her. After a few moments, she figured the seller must have left it for her, so she picked up the mirror, surprised at how light it was. As she carried it out, she felt a prickling sensation, as if someone were watching her. She glanced back over her shoulder and thought she saw a shadow flickering in the dimness. But when she blinked, it was gone. Shrugging it off, she loaded the mirror into her car and drove home. Once she got back to her apartment, she hung the mirror on her bedroom wall. She stepped back, admiring how it added an air of sophistication to the space. She thought it was perfect, but as she looked closer, something odd caught her eye. For a brief second, she thought she saw something moving within the glass. A faint flicker, almost like a shadow slipping behind her. She turned around quickly, her heart racing, but her room was empty. Laughing it off as paranoia, she went to bed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke with a start. Her room was silent, but she felt a strange, oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. She blinked, trying to adjust to the dark, when she saw it. The mirror, which she could just make out in the faint glow from the streetlight outside her window. But something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror didn't look quite right. The shadows seemed too thick, almost like they were alive, swirling and shifting in the glass. Her breath caught as she realized that her own reflection was standing perfectly still, watching her, even though she was frozen in bed. The reflection's eyes were locked onto hers, and she swore she could see the hint of a smile curling at the corners of its mouth. She bolted upright, turning on the bedside lamp and nearly blinding herself in the sudden brightness. When she looked back at the mirror, everything seemed normal. Her reflection was just her. But she couldn't shake the eerie sensation that she'd seen something she wasn't meant to. She turned the mirror around, facing it against the wall, and tried to convince herself it had all been a dream. The next night, though, things got worse. She woke up again in the dead of night, feeling that same suffocating pressure. This time, she heard faint whispers, like voices drifting just on the edge of hearing. She looked over at the mirror, which she'd placed face down on the floor, but somehow it had shifted, its glass now facing upward, the polished surface gleaming faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, each word barely intelligible, but laced with malice. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold, a handprint slowly forming on the inside of the mirror's glass, as if someone or something was pressing from the other side. Her heart pounded as she backed up against the wall, unable to look away. The handprint was long and bony, the fingers almost claw-like, dragging across the glass as if trying to claw its way through. In a panic, she ran out of her bedroom and spent the night on her couch, refusing to go back in until morning. The next day, she searched online, hoping to find some history about the mirror. After hours of digging, she found a newspaper article from decades earlier. The article told the story of a woman named Esther, who had been the previous owner of the mirror. According to local lore, Esther had become obsessed with the mirror, convinced it was alive and contained another world on the other side. She would spend hours each day gazing into it, whispering to her own reflection, until one night she vanished without a trace. Her family claimed to have heard her whispering to herself in her bedroom, but when they went to check on her, the room was empty, and her mirror was the only thing left behind. The mirror had passed through several owners since, and each had reported strange occurrences. Whispers, reflections that didn't quite match, shadows that flickered in the glass. Desperate, Sarah decided to get rid of it. She tried listing the mirror on Craigslist, hoping someone else would take it off her hands, but every time she uploaded a photo, it would disappear from the listing. Frustrated, she drove it out to a remote area and dumped it, hoping to finally be free of its curse. That night, she returned home feeling relieved and more at ease. She got into bed, feeling for the first time like she might actually sleep peacefully. But just as she drifted off, she heard it, a soft, familiar whisper right beside her ear. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the faint, chilling words. "I missed you." She bolted upright and looked across the room. There, against the wall, was the mirror. It had somehow returned, hung precisely where she'd first placed it, its dark glass gleaming in the faint moonlight. And in the reflection, she saw herself standing, but with a twisted, dark grin spreading across her face. The next morning, Sarah's landlord came by to check on her. When she didn't answer, he entered with his spare key. The apartment was cold, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. In the bedroom, he found only one sign of Sarah, a perfect reflection staring out from within the mirror, her face frozen in silent terror. Mark had always been a fan of odd collectibles, so when he found an ad on Craigslist titled "Vintage Children's Doll, Free to a Good Home," he couldn't resist. The photo was blurry, but the doll looked antique, with a porcelain face, dark glass eyes, and a faded blue dress. It sat propped against a dusty chair, its expression strangely lifeless yet oddly captivating. The ad was brief, containing only a few words, "Free to anyone who can come pick it up tonight, no questions." Mark was intrigued. He'd collected all kinds of odd things, old paintings, taxidermy animals, even a vintage ventriloquist dummy, but he'd never seen a doll like this before. He responded to the ad immediately, and within minutes received an address and a message. "Come at 11 p.m., knock 3 times. Do not come earlier or later." The instructions struck him as strange, but he brushed it off as part of the mystery. He figured the seller was just another quirky collector like himself. At 11 p.m. sharp, Mark pulled up to the address, a house at the end of a long, empty road surrounded by tall, overgrown trees. The house was dark, save for a faint light glowing in a single window. He hesitated, feeling a chill run down his spine as he stepped out of his car and approached the door. Following the instructions, he knocked 3 times, each knock echoing hollowly in the stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with deep-set, tired eyes. She said nothing, just stared at him, and then slowly nodded. Without a word, she shuffled back into the house, returning a moment later with the doll. She held it out to him, her gnarled hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "Be careful with her," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She doesn't like to be left alone." Before he could ask what she meant, she closed the door, leaving him alone on the doorstep with the doll in his hands. The silence around him felt thick, almost oppressive, and he quickly made his way back to his car. As he drove home, the doll sat in the passenger seat, its dark glass eyes reflecting the faint glow of passing streetlights. Every time he glanced over, he could have sworn its expression had changed slightly, its eyes seeming to look at him more directly, its mouth almost curving into a smile. He laughed at himself, shaking off the strange feeling. It was just a doll, he told himself, just an old, harmless doll. When he arrived home, he placed the doll on a shelf in his living room, admiring its craftsmanship. Its face was beautifully detailed, with faint cracks in the porcelain that only added to its character. He stepped back, studying it with satisfaction, but once again, he felt an odd prickle of unease as he noticed its eyes seemed to follow him wherever he moved. That night, he lay in bed, but sleep didn't come easily. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined those dark, glass eyes staring at him from across the room. Eventually, he drifted off, but his sleep was restless, filled with strange, vivid dreams. In one dream, he was in his living room, staring at the doll. It was smiling at him, its mouth stretching wider and wider until it became a gaping, black void. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as the doll began to move, its limbs jerking and twisting unnaturally. It crawled toward him, its eyes fixed on his, that horrifying grin growing wider with each movement. Just as it reached him, he woke up, drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing. He sat up, breathing heavily, and glanced at the clock. It was 3:33 a.m. His pulse slowed as he tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just a nightmare. But then, from the darkness of his living room, he heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. Mark froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint, almost like tiny footsteps, but unmistakable. He felt his stomach twist as he realized it was coming from the direction of the shelf where he'd placed the doll. Taking a deep breath, he got out of bed, his hands shaking as he made his way down the hallway. As he approached the living room, the sound stopped, leaving an oppressive silence hanging in the air. He switched on the light, his eyes darting around the room. The doll was gone. A chill ran through him as he scanned the room, searching for any sign of it. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Small, faint footprints in the dust on the floor, leading away from the shelf and toward the hallway. Toward his bedroom. He swallowed, his throat dry, and followed the footprints, feeling his heart pounding harder with each step. The trail led down the hallway, disappearing just outside his bedroom door. He took a shaky breath and opened the door, his eyes scanning the darkened room. There, sitting on his bed, was the doll, its head tilted slightly, its glass eyes gleaming in the faint light. Its expression was different now, almost triumphant, as if it were pleased to see him. He felt a surge of dread, but forced himself to approach, telling himself he was being ridiculous. He reached out to grab the doll, but as his hand closed around it, he felt something cold and sharp. A sensation that wasn't quite physical, but more like a sudden, overwhelming dread pressing into his mind. He stumbled back, dropping the doll, his heart racing. The next morning he decided he'd had enough. He put the doll in a box, sealing it tightly, and drove it to a nearby thrift store. He left it on their donation counter, relieved to be rid of it. But that night, as he got ready for bed, he felt that same chilling sensation, like eyes watching him from the darkness. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard it again, the soft scraping sound coming from the hallway. With a feeling of dread, he turned on his bedside lamp and looked around, his heart pounding. There, on the floor by his bed, was the doll, lying on its back with its dark eyes staring up at him, its mouth twisted into that same eerie smile. Panicking, he grabbed it, ran outside, and threw it into the dumpster, slamming the lid shut. He stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to close his eyes, convinced that somehow, someway, it would find its way back to him. The next morning, he went to check the dumpster, but it was empty. He felt a strange relief, thinking perhaps it was finally gone for good. But that night, as he lay in bed, he felt a weight pressing down on his chest. He opened his eyes, and there, sitting on his chest, was the doll, its face inches from his, its mouth twisted into a wide, malevolent grin. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The doll's tiny hand reached up, pressing coldly against his throat, and in that moment, he understood. It hadn't wanted a new home. It had been looking for something. Someone to possess. The last thing he saw was its glassy, dead eyes staring into his, filled with a darkness that swallowed him whole. The next morning, Mark's apartment was silent. His friends would later say they hadn't heard from him in weeks. When the landlord finally entered to check on him, he found only an empty apartment and a single doll sitting in the middle of the living room, its mouth stretched into a chilling, lifelike smile, waiting patiently for its next owner. Jenny was new to the city, working late hours and feeling lonely in her tiny, empty apartment. She had barely any furniture and was on a tight budget, so she turned to Craigslist, looking for anything that could make her place feel a little more like home. After a while, she stumbled upon a listing titled, "Free Sofa, Pick Up Tonight Only." The ad was short and simple, with a single blurry photo of a couch that looked old but clean, with dark upholstery and a high back. It wasn't the prettiest piece, but free furniture was too good to pass up, especially when her only other seating was a folding chair. She messaged the seller, who responded almost immediately, giving her an address and the same line as the ad, "Pick up tonight only." There was something odd about the sense of urgency, but Jenny shrugged it off and decided to go. The address led her to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the city. The lawn was overgrown and the windows were dark, but the couch was sitting outside on the porch, just like the ad had shown. She got out of her car, feeling slightly uneasy at the eerie stillness surrounding the house. The front door was open just a crack, and she could see dim light flickering inside, but no one came out to greet her. "Hello?" she called, but no one answered. After a moment, a man appeared at the door. He was thin and looked exhausted, with shadows under his eyes and clothes that hung loosely off his frame. He motioned to the couch without a word, his eyes darting around nervously. "Thanks for giving it away," Jenny said, trying to be polite, but he just nodded quickly, his gaze fixed on the couch. "Take it and go," he muttered, barely audible. "Please, just take it." Feeling a bit unsettled, she got the couch into her car with his help, though he barely spoke. As she drove home, she glanced at it in her rearview mirror. There was nothing particularly strange about the couch itself, but she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. Back at her apartment, she set the couch up in her living room, feeling pleased to finally have some real furniture. She spent the evening relaxing on it, reading and watching TV. It was surprisingly comfortable, and by the time she went to bed, she'd nearly forgotten about the strange interaction with the man. That night, however, she had trouble sleeping. She kept waking up to strange sounds, like faint creaks and whispers coming from the living room. She told herself it was just the old pipes or her neighbors, but each time she drifted off, the sounds would return, footsteps almost, moving softly across the floor. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She got up, turned on all the lights, and walked into the living room. Everything was as she'd left it. The couch, her coffee table, her bookshelf. She was about to go back to bed when she noticed something odd. The couch had a faint dark stain on the armrest that she hadn't seen before. She moved closer, frowning, and realized that the stain looked almost fresh, like a smear of something dark and sticky. Her stomach churned as she reached out, her fingers touching the damp fabric. It was blood. Jenny jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. She stared at the stain, wondering how she hadn't noticed it before. And then she realized with a sinking feeling that the blood wasn't the only new thing about the couch. There was an indentation on the cushion, as if someone had been sitting there just moments before. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly backed out of the room, turning off the light and heading back to her bedroom, trying to calm herself. She told herself it was just an old stain, nothing more, and that she was being ridiculous. But that night, the whispers started again. This time, they were clearer, echoing softly through the walls of her bedroom. She couldn't make out any specific words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. She lay frozen in her bed, heart pounding, until the whispers finally faded with the first light of dawn. The next morning, she examined the couch in the daylight, hoping she'd find some logical explanation for the stain and the sounds. She flipped over the cushions, checked the fabric, but there was nothing unusual. No signs of blood, no strange markings. She started to doubt her own sanity, wondering if she just imagined it all. But that night, things got worse. She woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hall toward her bedroom. Her entire body was tense as she lay there, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. Then the whispering began again, right outside her door, louder and more insistent this time. She could hear a faint scratching, like someone dragging their nails down the wood. She was too terrified to move, too paralyzed to even breathe. Suddenly, the door creaked open. She sat up, her heart hammering as she stared into the darkness. There, standing in the doorway, was the faint outline of a figure, tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes that seemed to gleam in the darkness. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching her. Jenny scrambled out of bed, grabbing her phone, but by the time she turned on the flashlight, the figure was gone and the door was closed. She could still hear faint whispers, like they were retreating back down the hallway. The next day, she decided to return the couch. She loaded it back into her car, ignoring the strange looks from her neighbors as she struggled to get it in. She drove back to the house where she'd picked it up, hoping the man would take it back. When she arrived, though, the house looked even more decrepit than before. The windows were shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. It looked as if no one had lived there for years. Confused and panicked, she knocked on the door anyway, but there was no answer. She peered inside, calling out for the man, but the house was empty, filled with dust and silence. Jenny drove home, the couch still in her car, feeling helpless and terrified. She tried taking it to a dump, but as soon as she arrived, the workers refused to take it, giving her uneasy glances and backing away. That night, she slept in her car, unable to bring herself to go back in her apartment. But the next morning, as she walked up to her building, she saw it, the couch sitting in the lobby as if it had found its own way back. Desperate, she asked her landlord for help, explaining everything that had happened. He reluctantly agreed to let her leave the couch in the basement storage room, hoping it would finally be out of her life. But even without it in her apartment, the strange occurrences didn't stop. Each night, the whispering would begin, growing louder and more insistent, always seeming to come from just beyond her bedroom door. Her friends stopped visiting, unable to bear the cold, oppressive feeling that seemed to fill her apartment. And each time she went down to the basement, the couch was there, sitting in the center of the storage room, waiting for her. Eventually, Jenny moved out, leaving the couch behind. She never spoke about it again, and refused to tell anyone where she'd left it. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd wake up to the sound of faint whispers, always just outside her door, and the soft, slow creak of footsteps, as if something were still looking for her, searching for the person who had dared to take it home.